Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee regular discussion meetings. It's great to have so many of you with us. I've lost count now how many times we have done this virtually, but one of the advantages is that, of course, we are able to have significantly more attendees than we would if we were restricted to a relatively small room in the House of Commons. So you are all very, very welcome indeed. We've got a very interesting discussion this evening on racial inequality in the UK scientific community. And to help us through that, I have three very distinguished speakers. Uchegbu, I hope that's an approximate, yeah, good, I'm getting a thumbs up. Professor Rachel Oliver and Professor Dawn Edge, and you're all very welcome, and I really do appreciate you giving up your time to join us this evening. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for approximately 12 minutes. I'll try and keep to time, but we're here to hear what you have to say, so don't get too fixated with bang on 12 minutes, but I will start to chivvy you along if it's going on too long. Obviously, it is a discussion meeting, so people are welcome to ask questions, but I would invite you to do that through the Q&A function within Zoom. And as I suspect we're all very used to now, if everyone could remain muted when not speaking, that would be very helpful. We're going to go through the three presentations and then we'll come to questions, and what will happen is probably someone will say so-and-so has a question and then invite you to unmute and ask your question in person. Now I'm going to get this started off, but then I'm going to be leaving and handing over the chair to Stephen Benn, one of our vice presidents, as I have as you can imagine, today's been quite a busy day. I have a briefing with Jonathan Van Tam at just before 6 o'clock. So I think what we will do is get on with our first speaker. And as I say, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ijeoma Uchegbu, who is Pro-Vice Provost, Africa and the Middle East, Chair in Pharmaceutical Neuroscience at UCL School of Pharmacy. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Please, sort of 12 minutes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thanks very much for sort of having me at this session. So what I'm going to do is share my slides so that you can see what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about race equality and what we've been trying to do to move the needle, acknowledging that there is racial inequality in the UK science community, and talk about some of the things we're doing about it at UCL. So thanks very much for all listening. And this is the overview of my talk. I'm going to talk about diversity and the organizational benefits of having a diverse community and having diverse decision-making. I'll also give you evidence that there is real racial inequality in the UK science community. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing at UCL. So I always put up this slide when I'm talking, and what I'm really trying to say is that if you have ethnically diverse decision-making, you have benefits for the organization in many, many spheres. You have companies introducing more innovative products. You have juries really relying on the evidence when they make their decisions. You also have more accurate pricing of stocks when you have ethnically diverse decision-making. And you have lots and lots of evidence that show that publicly traded companies tend to be more profitable when they've got decision-making bodies that are ethnically diverse. And then down to what we do in academia, we weigh our work by how many citations we have. You actually get more citations if you have an ethnically diverse author list. So quite clearly, one of the drivers for the kind of work we do on ethnic diversity is really looking at the positive. There are positive benefits for all concerned if you have ethnically diverse decision-making in a multicultural society. One other driver is when you see that there is inequality, and this next slide shows you that when you have income inequality, ultimately inequality does lead to, any kind of inequality leads to income inequality. Societies that have greater levels of income inequality have more social problems. They have more problems with infant mortality, homicides, teenage pregnancies, mental illness, and people going to jail. Now, you might think, well, actually, if I'm at the top of the tree, it doesn't really affect me. But you know what? You cannot really decide that if you're living in a society with a high level of homicides, that you're actually going to be protected if you are in a society with high levels of income inequality. And you can see where the UK sits on this particular graph. And the people that did this study have also gone on to show that the same result is got when you look at the states in the US. You have the same correlation. States with high levels of inequality like Alabama have more social problems. So the second driver is that if we want to live in a society where we don't have these social problems, we need to get rid of the inequality. And at that point, I'm going to talk about what happens in UK academia. And I'll briefly say the kind of work I do. I'm a professor of pharmaceutical nanoscience. My work is all about trying to design new drugs. We actually have designed a new painkiller that is looking at the opioid crisis. In response to the opioid crisis, you find lots of people that want to take painkillers tend to take opioids like morphine and fentanyl. This causes a high level of mortality within people taking prescription drugs for pain. We have invented a new pain medicine. We've licensed it out and it's currently being developed by the NIH. So that's a little bit about the kind of research that I do. And I have this side hustle on racial inequality that I also do. So looking at this data, what you can see is that there is very good participation by Black, Asian, and minority ethnic members of staff in UK academia. You have about 13% of people saying they're from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups who are UK academics. And this is really quite level with what we have in the community. The 2011 census say we have about 13% of people in our population that are either Black, Asian, or minority ethnic. Let's see what happens when they go up and up the tree. Well, 83% of professors are white and only 8% of UK professors are from a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic background. And a staggering 0.7% are Black. But in our community, we have, in our population, we have 4% of our population actually of Black individuals. And now what happens if you are female and Black? Well, if you're female and Black, you have a very, very difficult likelihood of actually becoming a professor. My fellow speaker, Dawn, and I are actually part of a group of 45 Black female professors in the UK. We can all fit in one room, for God's sake. And there are 20,000 professors in the UK, but the Black female professors can all fit in one room. The take home here is that if you're an ethnic minority academic, you are less likely to be promoted to the senior grade. And what about UK undergraduate students? What happens there? Well, what you can see with UK undergraduates, if you look at this graph, you can see just focusing on the top row, and that is the proportion of students, UK students in undergraduate courses that are white. What you can see is that these numbers have been declining over the last 5 years. So the number of, the proportion of students who are white that are participating as undergraduates in our higher education system is going down. And what you have is more students from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds are going to university. So pupils from minority ethnic families are more likely to go to university. Now, when they come to university, if they do not get a good product, well, they will vote with their feet and go to universities that do give them a good product. So this is, to engage with this agenda is an opportunity for universities. And I put this slide up to show you that even though you have these high participation rates, it comes at a cost to these students. Starting from the extreme left, Key Stage 2, and I'm looking at awards for Key Stage 2 A-level awards and degrees. What you can see at Key Stage 2 is that Black and white students have the same likelihood of achieving the standard. There is another conversation to be had around a third of students in the UK not achieving the right standard at ages 10 to 11. This is obviously not a good thing. But you can see that the Chinese pupils, they overshoot the white pupils and the black pupils, and the pupils from Indian backgrounds overshoot as well. Then you go to A levels, and we're looking at the proportion of students in each ethnic group that achieve 3 A's. 3 A's is that's the kind of thing you need to go to a Russell University and have good job prospects. And what we see is that when it comes to white pupils, it's 11% of white pupils that get 3 A's, 24% of Chinese pupils, they've maintained their lead that they had at Key Stage 2, and 14% of Indian pupils have 3 A's. And then what you see with black pupils, they've dropped further behind. Only 5% of black pupils will get 3 A's at A level. What happens when they go into our system and start to get their degrees? And these are for UK domiciled home students, UK students. What you can see is that 79% of white students will obtain a good degree, a first-class honours and a 2-1. What happens to Chinese students? 72%. So the lead they built up from Key Stage 2 to A levels disappears in 3 years. It's gone. Now 72% of Chinese students will get a first class and a 2-1. 71% of Indian students, again, their lead has disappeared, and 51% of black students, they've fallen further behind. And this translates quite directly into salaries of jobs, and quite directly into the students that will go on and do PhDs and then join the scientific community. So they are disadvantaged. Black pupils start to be disadvantaged at A levels. That's when we see it coming through. But when we get to university, all ethnic minority students are less likely to get a first class honours than white students. And so moving on, but some people just want to be scientists. So nevertheless, they participate in the PhDs. 18% of PhD science students are from Black, Asian and minority backgrounds. But when we look at the ones funded by our government, we could only find 9% of UKRI PhD students. The UKRI is our organisation that funds all the research in the UK. This is taxpayers' money, only 9%. We take this data with caution because a significant proportion of students did not disclose their identity. But what we can say here is, despite the fact that once they've gone to university, they actually do come out with lower quality awards, ethnic minority students do opt for a science qualification, do opt for a science career, but they find also the data appears to show they're less likely to achieve government funding for their studentships. When I was a PhD student, I had a funded studentship. It was paid for by a private company. I was a single parent with 3 children when I was a PhD student. And if I didn't have that funding from the private company, I wouldn't have been able to do my PhD. At the moment, I've had 21 years of unbroken Research Council funding into my lab. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have the funded PhD place. I wouldn't have been able to develop the medicine which is trying to address the opioid crisis if I didn't have funding when I was a PhD student. Let's see what happens when people go for grants. What happens when you're an academic is you spend your life on a treadmill writing grants, getting rejections, and getting the odd funded grant. You have to be at the top 10% to get funded. Now, in order for you to get funded, your reviewers must agree that your research proposal is good. The grant prioritization panel must agree that your research proposal is good. But if you look at the graph below, you can see that ethnic minority applicants are less likely to have an award. And ethnic minority applicants are less likely to have a prestigious fellowship from the EPSRC, which is our largest research council under the UKRI banner. And when you look at the way the decisions are made, we have a decent reviewer pool. 15% of reviewers in our reviewer pool are from ethnic minority backgrounds. 18% will submit what the EPSRC considers a review they can use on a grant. When it comes to the grant prioritization panel, you then see that ethnic minorities are less likely to get on a grant prioritization panel. and ethnic minorities are less likely to chair a grant prioritization panel. The chair is very important because the chair will moderate the arguments when people are arguing for one grant or for another grant. So the chair is very important, and ethnic minorities are invisible as chairs. I've chaired about 2 UKRI panels in my career, and I've chaired a couple for the Science Foundation England, Ireland. But it's very difficult for ethnic minorities to be chairing these panels. And what you can see is that ethnic minorities are less likely to get awards. So I've shown you evidence that there is racial inequality in science. I've also shown you evidence that if you have ethnically diverse decision-making, you have superior outcomes. Let me turn to the current COVID crisis. We have a lot of universities in the top 10 globally. Top 10, about 5,000 universities in the world. In the top 10, we have about 4 universities. We have the best scholars in the world, but we could not have a decent COVID experience. We've had more deaths. We've had more ethnic minority deaths. What does that tell you about the research narrative? We should have seen that coming if we were funding a diverse set of proposals. And that's something important to bear in mind. I think we need a race equality strategy across the whole education sector, right from Key Stage 2 onwards. I think schools should be rewarded for eliminating award gaps. The Office for Students have already said they want to eliminate the award gap between Black and white students by 24-25. Access agreements should reward universities that are able to eliminate their gap. And we should publish the data on race equality in every which way but which, so that people can see what's going on and hold us all as scientists to account. What are we doing at UCL? We've got the Race Equality Charter, a bronze award. In itself, the Race Equality Charter is not going to change anything, but it allows us to talk about race in various settings. What we do with the Race Equality Steering Group, I'm the Provost Envoy for Race Equality. Every year, I go to the leadership teams, I present their data, and we try and get them to change their data using various measures. We try and get them to change the award gap data, and we have found some faculties are able to reduce their award gap. We try and get them to recruit more Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals. And we get them also to make sure that when they're recruited, they're able to progress to the senior grades of grades 9 and 10. And this is some data from UCL. And what you can see is that in the last 2 years, and I'll talk about this quite busy slide, grades 1 to 6, 7 to 8 in the middle. Just
interrupt and say, could you sort of begin to wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the last slide.
Oh, fine.
1 to 6, in the at the far left-hand corner, 7 to 8 in the middle, 9 to 10, that's professorial or senior manager grade. And the gold bars is what you should look at, and that is for the proportion of staff that are from ethnic minority backgrounds. And you can see that we've increased those at grades 7 to 8. That's people that have a degree and are likely to progress to the senior grades. And we've increased those at 9 to 10. And so thank you very much for listening. And I'm really happy to take questions. Thanks so much.
Ijeoma, that was fantastic. Such a lot of information in there, and a really concise laying out of some of the challenges. I hope what we're going to now do, and perhaps this will come up in the questions, is explore some of how we might improve the situation. I thought some of your comments at the beginning around diversity and decision making made for better, more profitable companies is quite compelling, and it's how do you get that to a wider audience. This is a good thing for everyone to do, but as I say, I'm sure that will come up in questions. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I had to sort of speed you up towards the end, but there'll be opportunities to expand on some of those arguments in a bit. Right. We will move on to our next speaker, and then I'm going to have to depart, and so Stephen Ben will take over, and then I'll pop back in when I've had my briefing. So our next speaker is Professor Rachel Oliver. Rachel is a Professor of Materials Science at the University of Cambridge. Rachel, over to you.
Right, so hopefully you can now see my slides. Now there's going to be a degree of commonality between some of the things Ijeoma said and some of the things I'm going to say, and I hope that people will take that as stressing the importance of some of the things that Ijeoma just said. As Stephen just said, I'm Professor of Materials Science at Cambridge University. I'm also one of the leaders of a group called the Inclusion Group for Equity and Research in STEM, or TIGERS. We're a group of volunteers doing various activities to try and improve equity, diversity and inclusion in science subjects. I'm today going to be talking about what I refer to as the race funding gap. So I'm going to be talking about the specific issue of research funding that Ijeoma has already highlighted. I'm just going to first, though, mention a number of people from within the TIGERS group who really informed my thinking on this. Leah Lee, Tanvir Hussain, Hope Bratcher and Erinmar Archu. I want to mention those people because in many ways it would be great if they were here speaking to you today, not me. It's incredibly important on these types of issues to hear a broad range of voices and also to hear voices from across different career stages where people's experiences may be very different and that where change may be happening very quickly or indeed not happening very quickly in some cases. But thank you to all these people who've really informed my thinking on these types of issues. So why am I talking about funding? Well, this little cartoon is meant to signify the concept that money makes the world go round. And maybe some people think that in academia, we should be over these sort of above these grubby financial concerns. But actually to get our science done, we just do need funding. We need to pay the salaries of our researchers. We need to buy chemicals, consumables. We need to buy equipment. We need to access the high quality shared facilities that are available in this country. Without science funding from the research councils, it's extremely difficult to make science happen. It's extremely difficult to do innovation. And in terms of the kind of pipeline of people coming through to become the professors of the future, it's very difficult if you can't get your first start on the funding ladder to get a permanent job. Once you have got that start without the right funding, it's very difficult to get a promotion. One of the problems that some Black and ethnic minority people face in science is a real lack of role models. We've just heard how few Black female professors there are in the UK. And the funding pipeline makes it very hard for our excellent Black and other ethnic minority scientists to climb up the academic career ladder if that science funding money is not there for them. Now I'm showing here a graph that Ijeoma has in fact already shown. This is the success rates experienced by different ethnic groups within this data from the EPSRC. I'm just going to give you a few more words on this data. So this data is taken from a large data set that was released quite recently by UKRI, who are the main funder of UK academic research. And one of the things that's important to note is that they only publish data on ethnicity in these kind of three lumped groups, if you like. So they have data for white, ethnic minority, and as Ijeoma mentioned, there's a fairly reasonable cohort who don't disclose their ethnicity. Now that is the data we've got. It's what we're going to talk about because it's what's there, but it can really hide some of the problems that are occurring because we can't think of ethnic minority people as a kind of homogenous lump. I'm going to use this phrase, Black and minority ethnic, but I don't particularly like using it because it does just shove all sorts of different identities into one bucket. And it conceals the groups that maybe are having the greatest problems. So Ijeoma highlighted that the awarding gap is greater for Black students, for example. We don't know whether that's a relevant question in UKRI funding because the data simply isn't there. I'm using EPSRC data here, so data from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, because really that's my funding council, it's what I'm most familiar with, but also because with that familiarity, I know where some of the shortcomings of the data are. And also because I don't want to lump together all the different subjects across the UKRI because, well, the arts and humanities are a very different ballgame to the physical sciences, for example. Okay, so with all those caveats, I'm going to stress the same point that Ijeoma made. What these data suggest, notwithstanding the fact that they're not complete because of the people who don't disclose their ethnicity, is that there is a significantly lower success rate across all years in the last 5 for people in the ethnic minority group than for white people. The average white success rate across those years is about 33%, and for ethnic minority people, it's about 25%. And then if we look at the size of grants that people receive, so again, a substantial fraction of people not disclosing their ethnicity, but what we see is that in all years but one, so things maybe were different in 2014 briefly, but every year since, ethnic minority awardees, when they are awarded a grant, those grants are on average smaller by about £65,000 than those which go to white awardees. Now, what does that mean to the researchers who are dealing with these problems? Well, the difference in award rates basically means that a white researcher is going to have to write 3 research proposals on average to get a grant. But our Black and ethnic minority researcher is going to have to write 4. So that's probably maybe an extra 6 months work. The kind of blocks of paper on my diagram are intended to signify the very large amount of effort that goes forward into putting together innovative ideas to produce these proposals. And the piles of money are meant to signify what you get out of that work. And there's one less pile of money in my BAME column. And that missing pile of money here is about £65,000. Now, £65,000, to put that in context, that pays the salary of a postdoctoral researcher for a year, plus their various on-costs, pension, etc. Okay, so basically we've lost a person year's work here out of that project with this difference in available funding. And that can make a huge difference to what that researcher can get done. Now, I suspect there is somebody sitting in the audience who's thinking, well, science is a meritocracy, people just need to get on and write better proposals. I don't really think we can make that claim. So Ijeoma has already given us lots of evidence that more diverse groups are doing better science, more impactful science, impacting businesses in positive ways. I just want to draw out one specific paper addressing this issue that's come out this year. It's from Hofstra et al, writing in PNAS, and they did something which actually I find quite amazing. They got hold of 1.2 million PhD theses from the USA. This is almost every PhD thesis that's been written in the sciences between 1977 and 2015. And they took those PhD theses and they analysed them using an artificial intelligence approach to looking for textual markers of innovation. And when they did that, they found that students from underrepresented groups, from ethnic minority groups, were more innovative, were producing more innovative ideas more frequently than white students. But that novelty, those brilliant ideas they're coming up with, were discounted by their peers and they weren't rewarded and they were less likely to go forward into academic careers. So it's not just the ethnic minority researchers who are losing out. We are losing innovation and brilliance and new ideas from science. Ijeoma has already stressed that the peer review process is one place where BAME involvement is low, and that's going to affect how the decisions about awarding of these grants are made. Now, I was surprised to discover from the Higher Education Statistics Authority data that in engineering and physical sciences specifically, the population is about 20% Black and minority ethnic. So our situation where we only have just under 5% of panel chairs being from minority ethnic groups is a vast underrepresentation. I've headed this slide peer review with a question mark, because if Black and ethnic minority people aren't part of this decision-making process, is this for them really a peer review process where you are assessed by your peers? I'm not sure that it is. And I suspect that we have to be very concerned about bias in reviewer processes. So thinking about why we might see low success rates from Black and minority ethnic people, I want to stress that the evidence states that this is not about some kind of deficit in the proposals. This is about the system within which these people are putting forward their science. There's the possibility of bias in peer review and panels. Many ethnic minority people within the Tigers report that they get poor university support compared to their white peers, and that they find it difficult to access collaborations and research networks. What we're talking about is systemic factors. And those systemic factors can get you into a vicious cycle, because if you don't win funding, you don't have any money with which to do your research. That's kind of obvious. That reduces the opportunity to pursue your innovative ideas. It makes it more difficult to write high impact publications. It may mean that then your track record is less strong. And that track record is one of the things that's going to win you your next pot of funding. Equally, if you don't have money to support your research, in the modern university, they see that as your time not being paid for to do research. So they give you other jobs, administration, lots of teaching. Your time is taken away from developing your new and innovative ideas, and you have less opportunity to develop those into really good proposals. And again, these things can cycle. And that means that a little bit of unfairness, a little bit of bias in peer review or elsewhere in our systems can accumulate in a really damaging fashion. Before I finish, I just want to stress one particular call that's happened recently. Ijeoma mentioned the terrible death rates, particularly amongst Black and ethnic minority people due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And UKRI addressing that have invested multiple millions of pounds in research projects to understand that disparity. Now, a lady called Adi Adelaine from an organisation called Ladders for Action has been investigating this particular research funding call. Her specialty is actually in understanding and improving the inclusion and diversity and within the processes and within organisational cultures. So she has real understanding of this area. And she's found that of the £4.3 million awarded, there were no Black awardees. And that's despite the fact that from the community, she is aware that there were large numbers of Black people applying to the call, and there's real passion for work in this area from the Black community. Now, we're working with Adi's knowledge here because no diversity data was collected on applicants or awardees from this panel. That was overlooked in this process. And it's also worth mentioning that one member of that panel who allocated the funding will receive himself, having sat on the panel that decided who was going to get the funding, money from 3 of the 6 awarded grants. Now, we've been hearing quite a lot lately from government and from in the popular press about this bonfire of bureaucracy and this reduction in paperwork, and UKRI are joining in. They're reducing unnecessary bureaucracy. How are they planning on doing that? Well, apparently they're going to simplify and streamline their processes using the lessons learned during UKRI's rapid response to the coronavirus pandemic. A response that we've already seen led to the necessity of collecting diversity data being overlooked. So this is something that really concerns me, that we mustn't throw out the baby with the bathwater and make our processes worse in trying to make them more streamlined. I'm going to leave you with this slide comparing the effort that a white and a Black or minority ethnic researcher might have to put in to getting their research funding. Now, I'm a really privileged person as a white professor in Cambridge, okay? And I recognize that, and I don't have to get up in the morning aware of the data that I've shown you and that Ijeoma has shown you, and nonetheless knuckle down and do the work to write that proposal to try and win funding, okay? From that point of view, my voice here isn't really very important, but Ijeoma and Dawn, they are managing to thrive and succeed and do amazing science even in this context. So I really hope that you listen very carefully to what they have to say, because they're doing an amazing job. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rachel. I've now joined as chair because Stephen went off to a briefing by Professor Van Tam, and we're going to move on to our third speaker, but there will be plenty of time for questions. And I must admit, listening to our first 2 speakers, the numbers of questions that people might ask are rising rapidly. But thank you very much for the detailed presentation that you've given. Can we move on now to Professor Dawn Edge, who's the Professor of Mental Health and Inclusivity at the University of Manchester and the University Academic Lead for Equality, Diversity and Inclusivity. So Dawn, the floor is now yours. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm hoping my squeaky voice is going to hold up and that my screen share is going to work. We're good to go? Yeah. Yes, so I'm going to follow my colleagues by kind of grounding some of what they've been talking about in my experience, both at a personal level, but also in the work that I do. So as Stephen said, I'm a professor of mental health and inclusivity at the University of Manchester. And my primary focus in my research is addressing inequalities in health generally, but more specifically in mental health care. Currently, I lead a research team that's working to improve access to evidence-based care for African and Caribbean families affected by schizophrenia and related psychoses by developing culturally informed psychological therapies. And to understand why this kind of intervention is needed in the 21st century, I'm going to start by looking at the historical context of the relationship between the disciplines of psychiatry, psychology, and race. So scientific racism, or race science, as it's called sometimes, has been underpinned by psychology for a very long time. So, for example, theories about the purported racial hierarchies, with Black people just one up from primates, and then whites and Asian people. And you'll see, thinking that was a long time ago, but as recently as the year 2000, you had Rushton talking about acknowledging that we all originated in Africa, but then saying that as people moved further north, they required larger brains, their growth rate slowed, they had lower hormones, less sexual potency, it became less aggressive, less impulsive, and also developed skills around advanced planning and self-control and rule following, and were able to live longer lives. And all of these things, of course, were not available to non-Africans. Many of you will have heard of, or indeed studied, the bell curve. Oops, sorry. And you will, you'll know from the shape that one of the things that it talks about is about where the majority of people from any group sit. So what you'll see with this example of the bell curve is that it is shifted for Black people to the left. So this is the theory. And that means that the vast majority of Black people, according to this theory, are only capable of doing kind of supervised manual work, and very few are ever going to progress to the other end of the scale, where white people are, where there are white people in terms of that cognitive elite. And it's not just psychology, psychiatric categories have been developed, which have been specific to Black people. So drapetomania was one of those conditions that evolved, and it was deemed a psychiatric category to explain, and I quote, the inexplicable tendency of slaves to run away. And you might think, well, that's 18, it's 19th century, it's a long time ago, but as recently as 1914, that was still appearing in medical dictionaries. And in 2010, Jonathan Metzl did an amazing piece of work. This is called The Protest Psychosis, How Schizophrenia Became a Black Disease. And what he showed was that until the 1960s, which of course you remember coincides with the civil rights movement, schizophrenia was predominantly a condition that was diagnosed amongst white middle-class women. After the 1960s, it became associated, and you know that for a lot of people in the lay population, schizophrenia is one of those conditions that's linked with the public imagination, with crime and dangerousness and violence. And it moved, schizophrenia moved from being a label that was assigned to middle-class white women to being over-diagnosed amongst Black men in particular. And certainly in the UK, some people have talked about a schizophrenia epidemic. So globally, the prevalence rates for psychoses is 1%. And schizophrenia is only one of those conditions. And certainly if you go to the Caribbean and to Africa, the prevalence levels there are not dissimilar. But in the UK, if you are of Caribbean origin, your risk of being diagnosed with psychosis or schizophrenia is significantly greater. And also if you're Black African in compared to a white British person. And not only is there this over-diagnosis, but we also see is that the care pathways are also much poorer. So there are negative care pathways that often involve the police, rather than people going into hospital versus via their GP. And once people are in psychiatric care, then the kind of care they receive is much more coercive, involves much higher levels of control and restraint, being held in seclusion, and being forcibly injected with psychotropic medication. And there's also this lack of psychological therapy. So that begs the question, in an NHS that's founded on the principles of equity and lots of policies and practice guidelines, and an ethos of evidence-based, individualized, holistic care, why do these disparities persist? Might it be, or might at least part of the answer lie in the Royal College of Psychiatrists' 2018 position statement, when they acknowledged that psychiatry is institutionally racist? And these issues are not confined to mental health. You will probably have seen stories about the rates of death of Black women during pregnancy and childbirth. It's about fivefold the rates of white women in the UK. And during the pandemic, of the 10 women who died from COVID, 7 of those were of BAME backgrounds. And there's also emerging research from the US that shows that Black babies are less likely to die when they're cared for by Black doctors. And when you look at this research, body of research, one of the most noticeable and consistent features is the lack of research into eradicating the disparities. Much of the research is quantitative, so epidemiological, randomized controlled trials, and they often repeatedly investigate the problem with little emphasis on finding a solution. And there is a disincentive for academics to undertake the qualitative research that might help to foster some of these explanations, because qualitative research doesn't even feature on the hierarchy of evidence and is therefore rarely published in high-ranking journals. And that means that not only are the voices of patients, carers, and racialized communities largely silenced, but researchers who want to explore and better understand some of these phenomena are unlikely to A, get their research funded, and B, when they are funded, are less likely to get their work published in high impact journals. And those, as Rachel has very clearly pointed out, will enhance their careers and propel them into senior management roles, senior leadership roles, and decision-making panels, which at the moment are still predominantly white. We have more women, so we have some diversity, but still not as many as we ought. And so, as already Rachel's mentioned, the issue of the funding and the lack of opportunity for people to get research funding, and how, so I can tell you that I remember writing one of my research grants, and a very senior person in my organization reviewed it. We had an internal review process. And the response I got was, this is a really excellent proposal, but I don't think it will be funded, because you're actually wanting to do research in quite a niche area. But the desire for change is growing, and it is being led by lots of young, particularly young Black students. And I think both Rachel and Dejoma have touched on this, that students are restless and they recognize that they're coming to university and they're paying an awful lot of money, they're leaving with an awful lot of debt, and they're not getting value for money, they're not getting a product, they're leaving universities and they're not being able to maximize their potential. So increasingly people are looking to see what they can do to take matters into their own hands. And there is currently some funding being sought to actually establish a free Black university. And I think people will increasingly go to the places where they feel that they're going to be supported to actually make the difference that they want to. So I'm just going to conclude my bit of a story by showing you this gentleman. So this is William Arthur Lewis. So in 1948, Sir Arthur Lewis became the UK's first Black professor at the University of Manchester. He went on to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics, and his work is still informing economics today. He came all the way from a little island of the Caribbean called St. Lucia. And I'm from Jamaica. And in 2019, at the same university, I achieved my chair, the first and currently the only Black woman professor at the University of Manchester. So I'm going to leave you to do the maths about how long it's taken for that to happen. And so just to put that into context, again, as Ijeoma, just to reinforce the point that Ijeoma made, there are currently 12,000 people working at the University of Manchester, of whom about 7,000 are academic and research staff. So whilst you're blessed to have two of us on this panel, it's really important to remember that we're just two of just over 40 or so Black women professors in the UK. And that's 0.2% of the entire professoriate. I'm just going to end with some slides that just show some of the people who have been involved in my research and people from the community, and importantly, some of the young people who we are trying to mentor to get them to come into the space, into academia. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Dawn. Well, we now move on to the question period, and we have some questions that have come in. We have 3 professors to whom the questions can be put. And if I call the 3 names that I've got who first indicated they want to ask a question, please indicate, if you like, roughly where you're from and to whom, if at all, any particular question is directed. Otherwise, you might want to get the views of all 3 of the professors we have with us today. So can I first of all call on Barry Brooks to put his question? Barry, unmute yourself and ask.
I think Barry perhaps is not with us, Stephen.
All right. Well, then we'll move on straight away to Heidi Gardner. Heidi, would you like to put your question?
Heidi, you can unmute yourself now.
Hi. Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. My name's Heidi Gardner. I'm from the University of Aberdeen. I worked on one of the projects that UKRI funded for COVID. And I have to say we were embarrassed as a research team to be a fully white research team working on this project. But the main thing that we focused on was involving patient partners from different minority ethnic backgrounds to make sure that we had different voices heard within the work that we were doing. And those patient partners, as all patient partners should be, were paid for their time and expertise. I wondered if the panel could comment on their perspectives on patient involvement within their work. Many of the patient partners that I've come to know are fantastic and very experienced, but they tend to be from white middle class backgrounds. So it would just be interesting to hear how we can involve more diverse voices within that sort of pocket of health research.
Thank you very much. Would you like to go first, followed by Rachel, then Dawn?
Yeah, I just want to say that thank you very much for the question, Heidi. I've just got a short comment, and involving patient partners is a very good thing to do. But I think that also when it comes to shaping the research narrative, if that research narrative is about Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, then we really need to shape that narrative with a Black, Asian and minority ethnic researcher. I mean, that's all I want to say, and I'll sort of pass on to Dawn to talk about patient partners because I haven't worked with them myself. But I just wanted to reiterate that point, that it's very important that the research narrative is framed by people that have a lived experience of discrimination.
Thank you very much. Who would like to, Professor Edge, would you like to go?
I would love to. So thank you for the question. And I think it's really very important. I see so many of my colleagues, they've stopped doing it now because I no longer do it, but so many colleagues who have been awarded funding, and at the point at which they realize that their research sample is virtually devoid of any diversity, they will then reach out to someone like me and saying, what can we do to recruit more BAME people into our sample? And the answer is you need to do the work much sooner. So the kind of work that we do in our research team, which is going into communities and talking to people about what their concerns are, about what kind of research that they want to see as funding. So for example, the stuff that I've been talking about, our culturally informed psychological therapies, that came directly from community conferences where people told us that they were fed up with the only thing that was offered to themselves or to the family members when they went into psychiatric care being psychotropic medication, and that lack of access to psychological therapy. So we then worked with them to say, well, what would it take? What would the kind of psychological therapy need to look like for you to get involved in it? And importantly, what they told us was, it isn't the therapy, it's the therapists. You need to do the work around educating clinical psychologists and other health professionals to work with diversity. And one of the things I think is absolutely extraordinary is that in 2020, you can graduate from most health and care programs in the UK and having done no work at all about how to work with diversity and difference.
Thank you very much. Professor Oliver?
I think I don't have anything to add to particularly what Dawn has said there. It's outside my area of expertise.
Okay, thank you very much. The next person who indicated that they wanted to ask a question is Grace Abamba. So Grace, if you're there, could you please put your question?
Oh, hello, good evening, and thank you all very much for amazing discussions, and really, I guess most of it resonates with me. I'm not a researcher. I finished at the master's level. I wasn't particularly encouraged to go further, so I jumped into research and development. My question is slightly outside of what you've been talking about, but I still think it's relevant. Okay, so my question's around professional societies like the Pharmaceutical Society and Royal Society of Chemistry, which I see as really supposed to be safe places to support academia, support, students and graduates and so on, support career development and networking for jobs and businesses, which was discussed, I think particularly by Professor Ijoma. And so basically, does some of this behavior in terms of the way that the Black and minority ethnic people have experienced, does it translate into these professional societies in terms of, being active and being, inclusive and so on? Because I think it is still relevant. I know it's not in the middle of research and funding, which is all very important, but these are important places where we graduate and we all congregate. That's what I did as a Society of Cosmetic Scientists president. I was the first one after 70 years. That's where I went to meet people like me who had similar interests. A long-winded way of asking, have you seen anything in those places that could be inspiring or not?
I can quickly jump.
Who would like to? Ijoma, yes.
I can quickly jump in for the Royal Society of Chemistry and say that the Royal Society of Chemistry, I think they're beginning to understand that they really have to embrace the diversity and inclusion agenda. I think they've got a series of events lined up for quite soon, probably this autumn, really speaking to that agenda. But how deeply that is being carried out, I don't know. And with the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, I also don't know, but I do know that the Royal Society of Chemistry are starting to think about it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, It's amazing that they're just starting after all this time, but it's good to start at least, isn't it? Thank you.
Professor, would you like to come in on this question?
No, thank you. It's outside my area of expertise. I think Rachel wants to know.
All right, Rachel. Professor Oliver.
So I'm happy to be Rachel. So I think I would kind of draw out two examples here. One of which is that some of these professional societies, in terms of their fellowships, still use processes by which current fellows have to nominate the new generation of fellows. And I am always concerned that that process means that people nominate people like them. And one of the initiatives that I've seen going on amongst some of my colleagues is people pledging and taking great effort to make nominations which are not people like them. And that's something that as individuals we can do for things like fellowships and particularly for prizes of these institutions, which then helps to raise up Black and minority ethnic colleagues. An example from my bailiwick of a initiative that is intended to start to overcome some of these things is the Jocelyn Bell Burnell Scholarship in the Institute of Physics. It was an incredible donation from Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell to provide scholarships to underprivileged and diverse candidates, which was intended particularly to help people from racial minorities. One thing that I was very disappointed in this year was that although some incredible young women have been awarded those scholarships, as far as we can tell, all of those people are white. So these things don't always quite reach the communities they're intended for. And I think the institutes need to be incredibly careful of that.
Thank you very much. We now have 4 more people who've indicated they want to ask a question. Can I call first of all on Paul Jackson? Paul, would you like to put your question?
Sure, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for that information, which was really interesting, although in some cases kind of deeply depressing. But at least we've got a better understanding, I guess, of the position that we're in. What I wanted to ask you about was what the solutions might be to get rapid progress, because if we wait to go through the next 20 years of the current PhD students becoming the professors, actually it's such a missed opportunity in the meantime. Are there ways in which we could kickstart the process of getting more diversity and inclusion? Would greater international exchange, for example, be one way of doing that? And with adult retraining, it's one of the areas that I looked at in engineering in some detail, where we tend to reject people at each stage. And once you've been rejected, you're kind of thrown away and you can't come back in. Is the potential for those that have dropped out at each stage to be supported to come back in and really make a contribution, whether it's in industry, it's in research, in academic leadership? What do you think about those sort of solutions?
Thank you. Who would like to take that first?
I'm happy to.
Okay.
I think overall, if you're thinking about change, you need a few things. First of all, you need to collect the data. So when Rachel was talking about a particular call where they didn't collect ethnicity data, this kind of thing is really unforgivable. So you need to track the data so you know the scale of the problem. The second thing you need to do is you need to focus on the money. So organizations that are quite willing to embrace the equality agenda, they should be rewarded. And there should be a bonus associated with making sure you don't have awarding gaps, making sure that you have people being recruited into various schemes. And then when it comes to our PhD students, they should publish this. How many UKR PhD studentships were awarded to white students, awarded to Asian students, awarded to Black students? And this should be published annually. And there should be an incentive for the organization, financial incentive for the organization, to make sure that you don't end up with all the scholarships going to one particular group. Your issue on retraining is a very good one. Many years ago, I think it was about 20 years ago, the government set up a UK resource centre, and they were actually retraining women who were physical scientists and biological scientists to come back into the workplace after a time away. And I went to some of their meetings, so I was a member of the UK Resource Centre. And what we found is that the vast majority were Black, Asian and minority ethnic women who then wanted to retrain in order to re-enter academia. So that is a good idea. But overall, think about two things: collect the data and follow the money.
Thank you. Who else of our two speakers? Yes, Dawn, if I'm using first names now. Okay.
I think the other thing is that we need to think about the culture that we're bringing people into and how we change that rather than to change the people. So I certainly was dissuaded from, as I mentioned, from doing the kind of research that I'm now doing because it didn't necessarily fit very well with a standard model. And also thinking about how we progress. And, there's a lot of talk about doing more collaborative science, very definitely multidisciplinary the science that kind of involves more we than I, but actually the system isn't set up like that. So certainly when you look at the promotions criteria that I had to fulfill, they could have been written in, I don't know, 1950s with white men in labs in mind. And so the emphasis on the kind of research that we really need to do now that's going to propel us into finding the solutions to the world's problems, that they have to be collaborative. The way the systems are set up don't really reward that kind of collaboration. So it's collaboration on paper rather than the really kind of collaborative effort, which acknowledges that, for example, research outputs are collective. And, so we don't have to talk about the we all the time, that it's okay to mention, sorry, we don't talk about the I all the time. We can use we language to say that, we are part of a bigger initiative. So I do think that we need to also think about the systems. So I really welcome ideas about training people and retraining people, but we have to be careful not to slip into a deficits model. And we think about the system and what is it within the system that made people fall out in the first place, fix that, and then welcome them back in.
Thank you very much. Anyone want to add? Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, so I think I'd echo everything that Ijeoma and Dawn have said. I think particularly in terms of how we make these systems work, we have to enforce this idea of data collection, both at UKRI, but also within the universities. So UKRI audit my grants, yeah? And I have literally been in trouble with UKRI for having 47 pence of money in the wrong box with UKRI. But they can't manage to check whether my university, which has to make recommendations sometimes as to who goes forward for which grants, is doing that on a fair basis that's representative of the ethnic population within the university. So I've been pressing a concept which I call diversity audit, whereby just like you've got to be honest with your finances, you've got to have your data in a line, and you've got to be honest with the diversity of your population going forward for grants. I've been talking to UKRI about these issues for quite a long time now. The longer I do it, the more convinced I become it's important, and the less convinced I become that they should be policing themselves. So actually, I would like to see some kind of, I don't know, overarching body that keeps an eye on these things and keeps people honest, because I think that's really important, not ignoring these issues. And they do just get shoved aside and left to be kind of dealt with another day.
Thank you very much. Before I call on Susan Ayton, forgive me, but I did have a question in my own mind from early on, which is what data would you, all three of you, like to see collected that is not at the moment available? Because you've presented a great deal of data, which is terribly interesting. I just wondered if there's any more that you feel should be collected or you'd like to obtain, and it would be very helpful to hear what that is briefly before we move on to Susan's question.
I mean, I would definitely like to see the BAME unpacked.
Oh, yeah.
See that, because it is a catch-all. And when you actually unpack it, what you find is that Black members of staff and Black students are actually losing out the most. So I would like to see that unpacked as a minimum.
Right, thank you. Rachel, yes? Sorry,
Dawn, you go and then I'll go.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say the other thing that we need to do was, once we have that data, is think about how we analyse it. Because as you've seen with my story and Arthur Lewis, that the thing about intersectionality becomes really important. So, there's white women, Black men, and then there's Black women, and there's, and there are issues that affect us differently. So I think that's important. And just one other point, it's not just about collecting the data for the researchers, but also the researched. So I'm very surprised by the fact that, people can still get research funding, public money, to do research, and the exclusion criteria can be things like inability to speak English well, or lack of literacy, or a whole range of things that don't just disadvantage or disenfranchise BAME people, but anybody who has an issue with literacy immediately is excluded. So I do think there is much more in terms of reinforcing the notion of equality, diversity, inclusion that these research councils and funding bodies can do, not just in terms of the researchers, but also the kind of research they fund and what they expect the researchers to monitor in their data.
Thank you very much. Rachel.
So coming back to the research council's data, within the data sets that they hold, they do have an incredible richness of information, which a much more analysis can be done on, not just between different councils, but within the programs of different councils. So there's a huge depth of data analysis could be done. I think one thing that I think is very important is looking at things like grants and fellowships by value. So for example, if you look at fellowships, you see quite a good success rate amongst BAME people for some of the research councils, but the fellowship values they receive are on average lower. My guess as to an interpretation of that data, and it is a guess, is that if the EPSRC awards 3 levels of fellowship, postdoctoral fellowships, early career fellowships, and established career fellowships, that what we're seeing is a good representation of BAME people in the lowest level in the postdoctoral fellowships, and a gradual decrease as we go up the chain. But we can't see that, we're only guessing. And these sort of pipeline issues are key to getting our role models and frankly just brilliant people up that chain. And I think I'd also like to echo some of the things that Dawn's been saying. The data is not a goal in itself. I'm a data wonk. I love data. I love graphs. I love numbers. Yeah, but the data has no value unless it's used as a call to action and a tool to enact change. And I think that's the most important thing about the data, is how we can use it to pick out the problems with the systems that are damaging the careers of Black and minority ethnic researchers and fix those problems, not as a kind of like, oh, victory, we have data.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I call on Susan Ayton to put her question, please? Susan.
Thank you very much. So I'm speaking with my head on the Council of the Society of Cosmetic Scientists. I'm the founder and managing director of Ayton Global Research, and we supply consumer studies to validate efficacy claims for the cosmetics industry. We work in about 35 countries, and this is how I came to be on the SCS Council. So I don't actually have an academic background. I have a background in education. I'm a teacher by trade, as it were. And I'm trying to sort of go through some of the procedures that I went through in some teaching establishments to ensure that equality and inclusion are there, and visibly so, and hopefully in an auditable fashion. And so in building this model into the SCS, as we're gradually building up all of our policies and procedures, I would very much like to see a separate equality and inclusion committee that ensures that this ideology rifles through every single activity that happens with the SCS. And I just wondered, because we are a not-for-profit organisation, if somebody could help to answer the question as to what legislation we should follow if this is a legal requirement. Obviously, there's lots of great practice out there. I took my exemplar from Bristol City Council's Equality and Inclusion document, because they were an award-winning policy writer last year. So I thought that was a great place to start. But nonetheless, everything that I'm doing at the moment and that's happening internally seems to be voluntary, if you like. There must be something that says that if we take money from members, that we should be doing this, and who audits us, and how do we get that right? So sorry, Stephen, it's slightly longer than the way I worded it in my little comment. So I hope you've still got the essence of the question. Is there legislation for not-for-profit organisations? And if so, how do we obtain it, and how do we put that into practice?
Thank you very much indeed. Please indicate which one of you or all of you would like to just briefly address that question.
So the Equality Act 2010 is what we use when we are talking about the absolute requirement to make sure that individuals are not discriminated against due to their protected characteristics. That's what we use. And if you start from that, now whether it covers not-for-profits or just public bodies, I'm not quite sure. But if you start from that and read onto that legislation, then everything you're doing to make sure there is no discrimination should be supported by that particular piece of legislation.
Excellent, thank you.
Can I just say, I would agree with that.
Yes.
Certainly the Equality Act, as my understanding is, it's an act of law, so it covers everybody. But within that, many of you will know that there's a public sector equality duty, and that is specific to public bodies like universities or the NHS. So it is definitely covered under the Equality Act. What I would like to see, and I think maybe what you're getting at, is that law Is that act being reinforced? Is actually being backed up when people flout it? Because at the moment it feels a little bit like a toothless tiger to me.
Mm.
Yeah,
Thank you.
very, very much so. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. As a result of every discussion, a report is drawn up, and maybe that's one of the points that will be in the report. And we do try now to send summaries of the discussions that we have in this Parliamentary and Scientific Committee to the relevant ministers in order to draw points to their attention. Now, can we move on to Mark Spearing, who is next on the list? Mark. Are you still there?
So I'm here.
Well, please put your question.
Yes. So UKRI universities in promotion activities, appointments, place a lot of emphasis on understanding unconscious bias. It feels this is quite nice and soft, and the data you're sharing seems to me to suggest we're not being very effective. Should we be doing something more radical? And having spent 15 years in the US, I've experienced affirmative action in process. Should we be considering something like that, or at least something more radical than just surfacing unconscious bias? Sorry, my apologies. I'm the Vice President for Research and Enterprise at the University of Southampton. Thank you for your answers, and thank you very much for your very powerful presentations this evening.
I mean, I think that affirmative action would be absolutely brilliant, but it's not allowed under our current laws. But if we are thinking about the future, absolutely. And I argue that it will be absolutely brilliant because there is not a level playing field. As you've seen, students go into primary school. They by the time they finish primary school, black and white students are achieving the same level. But then there is a systematic destruction of any competitive edge until they leave university. So yes, if there was affirmative action, it might correct those problems. That's for this future, this wonderful future that we're all trying to get to. But at the present time, there are things like positive action that we can use, where two candidates are equivalent, and we can select one that is underrepresented in our staff body. There are also at UCL, we use something called the Fair Recruitment Specialists. These are people who are trained in employment law and trained in best practice recruitment. And they're from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And they sit on interview panels, and their job, really, they're in the room. So they stop these unnecessary, really destructive conversations taking place about the candidates. And I've used one of these fair recruitment specialists myself, and I've found them to be very, very good at making sure that we keep on point. And we do certain things like not discuss the candidates until we've seen all of them, and things like that. We ask them all the same questions, no special body language for one candidate over the other. And it actually does work if you use these specialists. Staff have come back and said they're a good idea. So these are the kind of things we can use at the moment. But of course, affirmative action will be fantastic.
Thank you. You were breaking up a bit there, but I hope everyone got it. We'll go on to Dawn and then Rachel.
Yes, I was just going to say, absolutely, we know that affirmative action is not allowed under the law, but definitely positive action. I don't think we do enough of that. I think people get confused and think a positive action is the same as affirmative action, which it isn't. But all of those things, I think, are great for looking at things from the individual perspective, as is unconscious bias training. But it's still not going to change the system. And it's the system that needs changing. And so, you know, Naomi, what you're talking about is that's targeting the system. It's saying we actually need to get people in the room who will stop us saying, oh, well, she won't, you know, she won't fit in here. That kind of person won't fit in here. And ask the kind of question, what do you mean? She's not one of us. That's the other kind of statements. So we do need to have the systemic change if we're actually going to see things substantially different. Everything else is tinkering around the edges. As you mentioned, there's a question mentioned, you know, we've seen in America, they've had affirmative action and some people have done very well, but still there's huge inequalities and they still persist. So it's not the total answer, changing the system is.
Thank you very much. I should add that if you're going to draw us into the American presidential election, we'll be here all night. Rachel.
I think actually, given what Ijeoma and Dawn said, I think anything I would add would only be further tinkering around the edges of the system. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we move on to Michael Sulu, please? You there?
Hi, yep.
If you're there, unmute yourself and please put your question.
I had, I guess I responded to one of the earlier questions to the panel, and the other question I had has already been asked, so I don't feel that I have anything extra to add.
Well,
Hi, Mike.
I've been amazed when someone in has gone ahead and asked their question anyway, but if you're known to the panel, which looks as though you are as they're waving at you, thank you very much.
Mike put me into Ijeoma.
Okay, can we then move on to Erinma Ochu, please, if you are there. Are you with us?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hello, please.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. I just wondered about what the role of universities is in these barriers that have been highlighted. What's going on? Do we need to be thinking about this qualitative research, the culture? How do we think about that? And then related to that, the same around the culture within these funding organizations. How do we embed EDI and social justice within the framing of research calls? Is there a way to think about that slightly differently?
Thank you. Who would like to take this first? I'm looking at our three speakers.
Rachel, this one's for you.
Okay.
Oh, is it for me? Okay, goody. So I think I would say that a lot of the concerns we see around funding are driven from universities as much as they're driven from funding councils. And that's also particularly true about things like PhD placements. And that then works back to things like UROPs, by which I mean university research opportunities for undergraduates, which are part of how you build your CV to get research placements. And I think we need a much more holistic picture of how we address all of those questions. So taking the example of undergraduate research placements, historically, those placements have often been unpaid. So if you can afford to spend a summer helping out in a lab, great, you can go and polish your CV. But many Black and ethnic minority candidates are not coming from backgrounds which have that economic underwriting to allow you to spend a summer living away from home, which costs money, and unpaid. So solving problems like that provides the opportunities for students to both polish their CVs, but also get these in-depth experiences. And those sorts of things can be missed. Equally, PhD placements increasingly are ever so competitive to get these funded PhDs that Ijeoma mentioned. And the system is increasingly, I think, favouring people who've either been able to do unpaid placements or kind of got lucky and been pushed and been promoted by sponsors who are part of the teaching that's given to them. And when we don't do that equally, when our culture doesn't promote a picture where you sponsor ethnic minority students and lift them up, then that provides a kind of shaky basis to build above that for postdoctoral researchers and research fellows, and then the academics. So the whole thing's like a house built on sand. Does that make sense? I'm not sure that was my clearest answer. Maybe Ijeoma can be clearer as to what I'm trying to say.
I mean, I'll come in and say this, Erinma. And Erinma and Leah provided some of the data that I presented. But just to say that, you know what's happening at the moment? Organizations publish their data and then they walk away. They literally toss it over the fence and they walk away. They've got nothing, it's got nothing to do with me. We need to change that so that organizations own their data. They should own the data that shows that certain people are not having these opportunities, and that is actually damaging it for all of us. Because as Rachel said, we're missing out on fantastic ideas. So organizations should own that. UKRI should own their data, universities should own their data, publish the data, and crucially, say what you're going to do about it in order to get rid of the gap. What are you going to do next year to make sure that we don't have this award gap when it comes to scientists getting awards after applying for grants? What are you going to do next year as a primary school to make sure you don't have award that, etc, etc, etc. So let them own it.
And hold themselves to account against those things they've owned. So not, oh, we're going to do this. We have these big, grand, beautiful targets. And then next year we have new, big, grand, beautiful targets, but no actual holding ourselves to account against, did we meet the targets we set ourselves?
Precisely.
Thank you very much. Dawn, do you want to add something? Yes.
Yes. So, Irimna, just very specifically, a relatively small and relatively cheap for universities thing that they can do is to address some of the things that Rachel's talked about, you know, the CV, how you can polish your CV to have a stellar CV if you can't afford not to get paid. And so currently on our research project, we have a paid intern, and she's paid from the universities through the careers funding and work with the alumni. And so I think we just need to be more innovative. And we also need to recognise that money is at the heart of why some students don't do well. And that's not just BAME students, that's also students from what are called non-traditional, i.e. white working class backgrounds. And so if we want those students to progress, then we have to make money not be a barrier. And so if we can give people paid internships, they're competitive, they're very competitive. People have to apply for them. We interview everybody, strong CVs and so on. But we've had a range of people working in our research team, white working class young people, Asian, African, all kinds of people. And those are the things that really, really help. And we've certainly had fantastic testimonies of people writing back to thank us for the time that they've spent. We've been able to get students to publish the work they've done with us. They've gone on to do master's programs, some of our PhD programs. We've got somebody who's a paid researcher with us. So it is possible. It is possible, but you have to have the will to do it, I think.
I see. Thank you very much. What about higher up the chain into the chat? And I think that's a very good question. And that goes to the attitudes of leadership and of senior leadership in universities. And there's, these are big and hard questions, Irimna, and not ones I necessarily have a clear answer to, but leadership is hugely important, and not just nice Black Lives Matter statements that go on a website.
Right. Now, look, I want to try and get in a couple more questions before inviting you all to finish with a 1 minute in which you'd like to highlight the major point or points you'd like to leave us with as we say goodbye. The question, next person to ask a question, please make it as brief as possible so we can have the answers, is Ian Haynes. Ian. I'll count to 10, Ian, and if you're not there, we'll move on. Well, it may be that Ian isn't with us.
I think actually, yes, Ian is perhaps on an older version of Zoom, and we're having difficulty for him to be able to talk, in fact.
All right, well, time is now short. Ian will reverse the order of the last two. Is Maria Aruda with us? Maria, would you like to put your question?
Sorry, there we go, Maria.
Maria, are you there?
Hello, now I could unmute. Good evening. It has been a delight listening to all the speakers and the lively discussion. So the research ecosystem relies on the Holy Trinity, that are the universities, the funding agencies, and the government. And each one of them should play a role in addressing these inequalities. So I wanted to ask the panel, I know it's a very general question, but what are their thoughts on how these three entities, these three groups can work synergistically to address inequality in research? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Ijeoma.
I was just going to say quickly, because I know we're running out of time, that actually the government and the funding agencies are sort of, they're giving the funding and they're giving the funding to the universities. And so, as far as I'm concerned, funding should follow people meeting their equality, diversity, and inclusion targets. Absolutely, funding should follow that. So publish your targets, show what you've done to try and reach them, collect your bonus. Repeat.
Thank you. Rachel.
I think my answer to that, I think Ijeoma is absolutely right. I would also say that where government is making big funding decisions, which also often lead to fast and potentially radical change in the sector, they shouldn't be doing that without considering equality. So for example, this new Advanced Research Projects Agency, to me, my big concern is that it's embedding this I picture of research, that it's coming from a place where you have the lone genius doing this amazing research project. And embedding equality is much more about what Dawn talked about a we culture. And I think that those sorts of sudden decisions that are being imposed on the research community, they need more discussion about their impact on equality, because they could be really far reaching.
Thank you very much. I should add, by the way, that anyone interested in this idea of a UK ARPA can follow the House of Commons Select Committee hearing, which was last week on this subject with some very interesting witnesses. Dawn, would you like to add a word to this?
Not much to add, really. I just think the most important thing, we've talked about the data and how important it is to collect that, but not just to collect it and then collect more, is to actually use the data to drive change. And that means there has to be some accountability somewhere. Somebody somewhere has to be looking at that data, looking at what people have identified as their key performance indicators or whatever they're going to call them, and making sure they deliver against them and that they're rewarded accordingly or not.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Now, we are now at the end. If our three speakers would like to leave us with one thought in 30 seconds or more, we could go in reverse order, even if it's to repeat what you already said, but it would be a nice thing to hear something you'd like to highlight at the very end. So Rachel, would you like to go first? Reverse order.
If you're reversing the order, Dawn would be first, I believe.
All right. I'm very happy. Dawn.
That's absolutely fine. So my main point is that this is really important in terms of people's academic and research careers. But bearing in mind, please, that this also ultimately transfers into life and death. So just remember those slides of the number of women who are dying in pregnancy and childbirth, and the number and the fact that if you're a Black baby, you're likely to survive better if you have Black doctors looking after you. So it's a life and death issue in the end.
Thank you very much. Rachel, would you like to go next?
Well, I don't think there's a bigger point to make than Dawn has just made, but I think I would say follow the money, that the money really influences what is possible for scientists, and understanding how that money flows and then acting on that understanding is key to making change in the sector.
Thank you. And Ijeoma.
Thank you very much. I mean, my two co-speakers, Dawn, yeah, life and death. Rachel, absolutely, the money is important. All I will say is that if you want to have change, first of all, you need to know the scale of the problem. So you need to collect the data. Then you need to ask people what they're going to do about the data and how they're going to address clear deficits in the system that are causing people to lose their life, as we've seen with COVID. And then you have to hold them to account when they do make the changes they say they're going to make. And then you have to also reward them when they make the changes. So money should follow good practice, and it should be at the top of the things we do.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that's perfect timing. It brings us sadly to the end. I'd like to thank all three of the professors who have presented their views to us tonight, not just for the excellence of their presentations, but also for the discussion that's followed. Thank you so much for being with us. It's high time in the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee that we had a discussion of this sort, and it certainly mustn't be the last. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining us. I believe it's been a record number of people who have joined us today, over 150, in which case I very much hope that you would like to come back for our next meeting. And if only I could remember when it is, look at our website for details. But in future, I hope to welcome you when you can come to the House of Commons for some of our meetings. But I think the key to the success in the future is to hold them in person, but also live stream them across the country. So thank you to everybody for taking part. And it's now just about to come up to the 7 o'clock news. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Okay.
Bye.
Very well.
Yeah.